Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something foundational and, frankly, pretty critical for anyone who wants to navigate the skies, regardless of what the weather is doing. We're taking a deep dive into the world of flying under instrument flight rules, or IFR.
That's right. Yeah. Our mission today is to, unpack what it truly means to fly when you can't rely on just seeing the horizon or the ground below.
Right.
We're pulling back the curtain on this, complex system using a key section of the Instrument Flying Handbook as our guide.
Okay.
Think of this as your essential brief on how pilots plan, how they talk to air traffic control, and execute a flight when the weather gets challenging.
It sounds like a whole different ballgame compared to just looking out the window, doesn't it?
Right.
Where does a pilot even begin when the weather report looks, well, less than ideal?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
It all starts before you even get near the plane with pre-flight planning. And the very first step is knowing where to get the authoritative information you need. The handbook points us to several crucial resources.
Okay, let's dive into those. What are the must-have documents?
Well, you've got the core navigation products from the National Aeronautical Navigation Products Group, Aeronav, basically. These are your IFR en route charts for flying between airports, then area charts for detailed views of congested terminal areas,
Okay.
and your U.S. Terminal Procedures publications, or TPPs. The TPPs are just packed with diagrams of airports and, maybe most importantly, the procedures for instrument approaches and departures.
So the maps and the specific playbooks for getting into and out of airports when it's cloudy?
Exactly. And complementing those are the official guidance documents from the FAA, the Aeronautical Information Manual, the AIM.
The AIM. Essential reading.
It really is. It's your essential guide to basic flight info, how the air traffic control system works, standard procedures. Then there's the Airport Facility Directory, the AFD.
AFD, right.
Which is just an incredible resource for details on specific airports, radio frequencies, navigation aids, preferred IFR routes, even things like runway lighting capabilities and special notices like LAHSO information, landing and hold short ops.
That sounds like the pilot's go-to reference for, well, everything about the airport itself.
It really is. And don't forget the Notice of the Airman publication, the NTP. This consolidates time-sensitive info NOTAMs that can affect your flight.
Things that have changed recently.
Right, things that might not be on the published charts yet, including regulatory FTC NOTAMs that might temporarily change a procedure or chart. Very important.
So charts, manuals, detailed airport info, and these real-time updates. Plus, I assume you need to know the specific airplane you're flying inside and out.
Oh, absolutely critical. Your pilot's operating handbook, the POH, or the airplane flight manual, the AFM, whatever it's called, for your specific aircraft, contains all the limitations, performance data, specific procedures for that aircraft. The handbook really emphasizes that even if you fly the same route or the same plane all the time, you must review the relevant materials for each flight. Conditions change, notices get issued. Familiarity helps, sure, but that pre-flight review is just non-negotiable for safety.
That makes total sense. You can't just assume everything is the same as last time, especially when you're relying so heavily on this system. So, okay, you've done your planning, checked the weather, reviewed all the docs. Now it's time to fly. But you need permission first, right?
Right. That permission comes in the form of an IFR flight plan. Under federal regulations, specifically 14 CFR Part 91, you are required to file and receive an IFR clearance to operate in controlled airspace in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC.
How does a pilot actually file that plan? Is it all electronic now?
Well, there are several ways. You can file electronically through systems like DUATS, which is very common these days.
Okay.
You can also call Flight Service Station, FSS, at 1-800-WX-BRIEF. That's still a primary method for many.
The old...
Yep. Or, at some airports, you can still file in person at an FSS or even an air traffic control tower, ATCT. And maybe as a last resort, if other means aren't available, you can sometimes file by radio once you're airborne.
Filing from the air, wow, that sounds complicated. When would you typically do that?
Usually if you're flying VFR and the weather unexpectedly deteriorates ahead, maybe worse than forecast.
Right.
Or if you're operating outside controlled airspace and you need to enter it in IFR conditions, you'd contact FSS or the Controlling Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC, directly.
Okay.
The handbook does caution, though, that during really busy times, ATC might not be able to easily accept flight plans over the radio. Traffic saturation can be an issue.
Makes sense. And how far in advance should you file?
The handbook recommends filing at least 30 minutes prior to your estimated departure time.
Okay.
This gives ATC time to process your request, coordinate it, and have your clearance ready, which helps minimize delays on the ground. There's a specific form, FAA Form 7233-, and the AA has detailed guidance on filling it out correctly.
Okay, so flight's over, you're safely on the ground. What happens with the flight plan then? Does it just disappear?
No, canceling is crucial. If you land at an airport that has an operating control tower, your IFR flight plan is canceled automatically when you touch down.
Convenient.
Very. However, if you land at an airport without a tower, it's entirely the pilot's responsibility to cancel.
How do you do that?
You can do it by radio while still airborne if you're in VFR conditions outside of Class A airspace.
Okay.
Or, more commonly, you call FSS or ATC by phone after you've landed. The handbook really stresses the importance of canceling as soon as possible so that the airspace and routes can be opened up for other IFR traffic waiting to use them.
Right, you don't want to hold things up. And what if the weather clears up while you're en route? Can you just cancel then?
Yep. If you encounter VFR conditions and decide you no longer need IFR separation and services, you can contact ATC and just say, cancel my IFR flight plan. Once you do that, though, ATC separation services are immediately terminated. You're then operating VFR and responsible for your own separation and navigation under VFR rules.
Got it. So, flight plan filed. Now you need the actual green light from ATC, the clearance. What's the fundamental purpose of that clearance?
The clearance is essentially ATC's instruction set for your specific flight within controlled airspace. Its primary purpose, really its only purpose, is to provide separation between known aircraft.
Just separation.
Just separation. It dictates things like your route, your altitude, sometimes even your speed, or specific departure instructions to keep you safely away from other planes.
And getting that clearance right, reading it back correctly, that sounds absolutely critical for safety.
Oh, absolutely. Voice communication is still the primary means, and that mutual understanding between the pilot and controller is just vital. The handbook emphasizes standard phraseology, clear readbacks of clearances, and prompt responses. Miscommunication, especially during taxi operations, is a huge risk factor for things like runway incursions.
Yeah, you hear about those. The handbook gives some examples of how varied clearances can be. Can you give us a feel for that?
Sure. A really simple one might be something like, clear to Deauville Airport direct, cruise 5,000.
Cruise 5,000. What does cruise mean there exactly?
Yeah, the cruise term is interesting. It means you're cleared to operate at any altitude from the minimum IFR altitude for that segment all the way up to and including 5,000 feet.
Oh, okay.
You can climb and descend within that block of airspace at your discretion. However, and this is key, once you report leaving an altitude within that cruise clearance, you cannot return to it without getting a new clearance from ATC. So it gives you flexibility, but with a restriction.
That's a really key nuance. Okay, what about a clearance with a more specific route?
You might get something like cleared to Skyline Airport via the Crossville 055 radial, Victor 18, maintain 5,000, clearance void if not off by 1330.
Okay, breaking that down.
So that gives you the route segments, the radial, the airway, and initial altitude to maintain, and then a clearance void time. If you're not airborne by 1330 Zulu time, that clearance is no longer valid, and you have to get back in touch with ATC before you go.
Right, keeps the system moving. And they can get pretty detailed, right? Covering multiple segments or even holding instructions built right in.
Oh, absolutely. They can get quite complex. Imagine hearing something like this. Cleared to Wichita Mid-Continent Airport via Victor 77. Hold west on the Oklahoma City 277 radial. Maintain 5,000 to Cashin intersection. Climb to and maintain 7,000. Departure control frequency will be 1.05, squawk 0412.
Wow.
Yeah, that single clearance gives you your route, a specific holding instruction at a particular fix, points where your altitude needs to change, your departure frequency to talk to after takeoff, and your unique transponder code, all packed in there.
And sometimes the clearance just references a pre-planned procedure like a departure procedure or DP.
Exactly. An abbreviated clearance might sound like. Cleared to LaGuardia as filed. Ringo's 8 departure Phillipsburg transition. Maintain 8,000. Departure control frequency will be 120.4, squawk 0700.
Okay, Ringo's 8 departure.
Right. And the handbook points out you need to have the details of that specific DP, the Ringo's 8 departure in this case. You need to have the chart or the text description and understand it before you accept that clearance.
Because once you accept it, you have to fly it. No excuses.
Precisely. Compliance with your ATC clearance is mandatory. But, and this is also crucial, the handbook makes it very clear that pilots are required to request an amended clearance if the one they're given isn't fully understood.
Okay.
or if they consider it unsafe for any reason, or if it would cause them to deviate from a regulation, or if it's simply impractical or unacceptable due to maybe aircraft performance limitations or the current weather conditions.
So you still have that final authority.
You are the pilot in command, and safety is always the absolute priority.
Yeah.
You have the responsibility to speak up if a clearance doesn't seem right.
Okay. So ATC issues these clearances specifically to provide separation. How do they actually achieve that separation between IFR flights?
Well, they have several standard methods in their toolkit. They can provide vertical separation by assigning different altitudes to aircraft that might be on the same route or in the same area.
Okay.
They can use longitudinal separation, which means ensuring a minimum time interval or distance between aircraft following the same path at the same altitude.
Like keeping planes spaced out on final approach.
Exactly. Then there's lateral separation, which involves putting aircraft on different diverging flight paths or routes.
Yeah.
And most commonly today in radar environments, they use radar separation, which allows controllers to use smaller separation minima because they can see the precise position and track of the aircraft. It combines all these techniques.
But I've heard there are situations where you might be flying IFR, you're on an IFR flight plan, but ATC isn't actually providing separation. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? And it's a critical point to understand. ATC does not provide separation when you're operating outside of controlled airspace, simply because they don't have jurisdiction or surveillance there.
Makes sense.
Also, and this catches people sometimes, if you're on an IFR clearance, but ATC has authorized you to fly VFR on top.
We'll get to that distinction later, yeah.
Right. Or if you're cleared to climb or descend in VFR conditions, you are then responsible for seeing and avoiding other traffic, just like any VFR pilot. ATC isn't separating you from all other aircraft in those VFR conditions, especially uncontrolled VFR flights.
Good point. Okay, sometimes they manage traffic flow with speed adjustments too, right?
Yes, definitely. You might be asked by ATC to, say, slow to 100 knots or increase speed to 120 knots to help maintain spacing or sequence traffic. If you get a speed adjustment like that, you're expected to maintain it within plus or minus 10 knots of the assigned speed.
And if you can't, maybe due to turbulence or aircraft limits.
Then you absolutely must advise ATC immediately. Communication is key there.
Okay. And what about visual separation?
This is another situation where responsibility shifts. ATC might identify traffic that you should be able to see and ask you, traffic at your 10 o'clock, 5 miles, do you have the traffic in sight? If you say yes, they might then ask, can you maintain visual separation? If you accept that instruction, Roger, maintaining visual separation, you are now responsible for maneuvering your aircraft to stay safely separated from that other aircraft. You also accept responsibility for wake turbulence avoidance. It's essentially a transfer of the separation task from ATC to the pilot.
Interesting. So for ATC to provide any separation, they need to know where you are. In a radar environment, that's fairly straightforward for them. But what happens if you're flying IFR somewhere without radar coverage?
Great question. That's where position reports become absolutely essential. When you're operating IFR outside of radar contact, ATC is relying entirely on your reports to follow your progress along your route. Right. They use those reports to calculate your estimated time over future points, figure out your distance from other aircraft, and ensure standard separation is maintained. So the accuracy of those reports is vital for your safety and the safety of everyone else flying IFR in that area.
When are these position reports actually required? Is it every few minutes?
No, it's based on specific points shown on the IFR charts. The handbook specifies you must report when you are over each compulsory reporting point. These are depicted on the charts as solid, filled-in triangles.
Okay, solid triangle means report.
Right. You report over these regardless of your altitude, even if you happen to be flying VFR on top on an IFR clearance. You also need to report over any points that specifically define a direct route segment you're flying, like if you're going direct between two VORs, not on an airway.
What about the other points, the open triangles?
Those are non-compulsory reporting points. You only need to make a report over those if ATC specifically requests it. Otherwise, you just fly over them without reporting.
Got it. So essential checkpoints require reports. What information actually goes into a standard position report? It sounds like it's probably more than just saying, hey, I'm here.
Yeah, there's a specific format, a checklist really, to make sure ATC gets all the necessary details quickly and clearly. The key information, according to the handbook, is your aircraft identification, your position, the name of the reporting point you just passed, the time you were actually over that point, usually in minutes past the hour Zulu time, your current altitude or flight level, and you need to state your actual altitude if you're VFR on top.
Mm-hmm.
Then, the type of flight plan IFR, although this is sometimes omitted if you're reporting directly to an ARTCC controller or approach control who already knows your IFR.
Right.
Then, critically, the estimated time of arrival and the name of your next compulsory reporting point along your route. And finally, the name only of the next succeeding reporting point after that one, plus any pertinent remarks, like if you encountered unexpected weather.
Wow, that's quite a list. ETA next, name only of the one after that. How do you usually initiate that report with ATC? Just start talking.
No, you typically include the reporting point name in your initial call-up to get their attention and let them know what the call is about. For example, you'd say, Atlanta Center Cessna 1230 Alpha at Jails Intersection.
Okay.
Once they acknowledge you, maybe with Cessna 30 Alpha, go ahead. Then you give the full report following that format we just discussed, like Atlanta Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha at Jails Intersection, 5000, estimating Monroeville at 1730, next is Maxwell.
Gotcha. And when do you stop having to make all these compulsory reports?
You can discontinue reporting over those designated points when ATC advises you that you are in radar contact.
Ah, okay.
That means they can see you on their scope and are providing radar separation. Conversely, if they later tell you radar contact lost or radar service terminated, you must resume making those compulsory position reports.
Makes sense. Now, are there other types of reports pilots have to make automatically, even without being specifically asked by ATC?
Yes, definitely. There's a whole list of specific events or conditions that you, as the pilot in command, are required to report as soon as practical when you're operating in controlled airspace under IFR. This is all about keeping ATC informed of anything that might affect your ability to fly the clearance safely or might impact other traffic.
What kind of things are on that list?
Okay, reports required at all times include any time you vacate a previously assigned altitude for a new one, any altitude change if you're flying VFR on top, if you find you're unable to climb or descend at a rate of at least 500 feet per minute.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, they need to know that for separation planning.
Yeah.
Whenever you execute a missed approach, you report that immediately, and then you need to follow up by requesting your next clearance, what you want to do next.
Right.
Also, if your average true airspeed changes by 5% or 10 knots, whichever is greater, from what you filed in your flight plan, they use that filed speed for timing estimates. You also report the time and altitude when you reach or leave a holding fix. And critically, any loss or impairment of certain navigation, approach, or communication equipment.
Equipment malfunctions seem particularly important to report immediately.
They are. The handbook specifically calls out reporting the loss of capabilities for VOR, TACAN, or ADF receivers, any complete or partial loss of ILS receiver capability, any anomalies or problems with your IFR-certified GPS, or any impairment of your air-to-ground communications.
What do you tell them when you report an equipment issue?
You need to include your aircraft ID, exactly what equipment is affected, the degree to which it impairs your ability to continue operating safely under IFR, and what kind of assistance you might need from ATC, like maybe vectors or a different type of approach. And of course, sort of a catch-all, any other information relating to the safety of flight must be reported.
Makes sense. What about when you're specifically not in radar contact? Are there any extra reports required then?
Yes, a couple of important ones. When you're not in radar contact, you need to report when leaving the final approach fix inbound on a non-precision approach.
Okay.
Or when leaving the outer marker, or the fix designated in place of the outer marker, inbound on a precision approach like an ILS. Also, if you realize that a previously submitted estimated time for arriving at a reporting point is going to be off by more than 3 minutes, you need to contact ATC and provide a corrected estimate. That timing is critical for their non-radar separation.
3 minutes, okay. And weather. Do you routinely report unexpected conditions you encounter?
Absolutely. The handbook states you are expected to report weather conditions that haven't been forecast, or any hazardous conditions that were forecast, but maybe you're experiencing them differently. Sharing that information helps ATC keep other pilots informed and contributes to overall safety.
Okay, that covers reporting well. Let's transition now from the planning and reporting phases to actually leaving the airport in IFR conditions. You mentioned departure procedures, DPs, earlier. Let's unpack those a bit more.
All right. DPs are standardized, pre-planned IFR procedures. Their primary purpose, their reason for existence, is to provide guaranteed obstruction clearance from the terminal area immediately surrounding the airport out to the appropriate en route structure. They basically give you a safe, pre-charted path to follow as you climb out.
A safe corridor out. Are pilots actually required to fly them?
Well, under Part 91 operations, like most general aviation flights, you are strongly encouraged by the FAA to file and fly a DP if one is available for your departure airport and runway. It's generally the safest way to depart in IMC.
Okay. Are there different types of DPs?
Yes, there are two main types. First, you have obstacle departure procedures, or ODPs. Their sole focus is ensuring you clear obstacles during climb-out. ODPs can be presented in either textual format or graphically on a chart. If it's a graphic ODP, it will have obstacle included in the title.
And you can just fly those?
Interestingly, yes. You can actually fly a published ODP without an explicit ATC clearance specifically mentioning it, unless ATC assigns you a different departure clearance, like radar vectors.
Okay, that's ODPS. What's the other type?
The other type is Standard Instrument Departures, or SIDs. SIDs are always presented graphically. They are designed not only for obstruction clearance, but also to simplify clearance delivery and reduce frequency, congestion, and workload for both pilots and controllers, especially in busy terminal areas.
Ah, so they help the system flow better too.
Exactly. But unlike ODPs, SIDs always require an explicit ATC clearance to be flown. You can't just decide to fly a SID on your own.
Where do you find these procedures published?
ODPs are typically found in Section C of the U.S. Terminal Procedures Publication booklets, often located alongside the IFR takeoff minimums for the airport. SIDs are usually collocated with the instrument approach procedures for that same airport in the TPP.
So if a DP exists for my departure, I might get it in my clearance, like that Ringo's 8 departure example we talked about earlier.
Precisely. If a DP is published for your airport and intended route, you should expect that it might be included in your IFR clearance. And if you accept a clearance that contains a DP, like the Ringo's 8,
you must fly it.
You absolutely must comply with its published route and altitude restrictions. The handbook really stresses the importance of having the textual description or the graphic chart for that specific DP readily available and making sure you understand it before you accept the clearance.
What if you don't have it, or maybe you're not comfortable with it?
You need to tell ATC. You can do this either by putting no DP in the remarks section of your flight plan when you file it, or by advising the controller directly when they issue the clearance, something like unable Ringo's 8 departure. They'll then likely give you alternative instructions, probably radar vectors.
Speaking of radar vectors, in really congested areas, do they often just give you headings with radar instead of a published DP?
Yes. Radar-controlled departures are very common, especially out of major airports. Instead of following a published route, you'll get specific guidance via radar vectors from departure control.
How does that work?
Before you even take the runway, APC will typically give you an initial heading to fly immediately after takeoff. This is crucial in case you lose communications right after liftoff.
Ah, a lost comm procedure built in.
Exactly. Then, after takeoff, you contact departure control on the assigned frequency. They'll confirm radar contact, usually by saying radar contact, and then start issuing you specific headings to fly, altitudes to climb to, and climb instructions to safely vector you around other traffic and onto your desired route or towards the next controlling facility. Eventually, they'll tell you something like resume-own navigation.
But even when you're getting radar vectors, they're still responsible for the overall navigation, right? You don't just blindly follow headings.
Absolutely not. Radar control does not relieve you of your pilot and command duties. You still need to be prepared to navigate based on your original clearance. You need to ensure your own navigation receivers are correctly tuned and working. You need to monitor your flight instruments constantly, be aware of your position relative to your cleared route, and keep track of things like time over checkpoints, even while ATC is providing vectors. Situational awareness is key.
Right. Okay, so once you're past that initial departure phase, maybe handed off to center, you're considered en route. What's flying en route under IFR typically like?
Well, it really varies quite a bit depending on your specific route, the amount of traffic around, and which ATC facility is controlling you. Your flight might be continuously monitored and guided by radar surveillance for the entire trip.
Oh, okay.
Or, in other areas, particularly less congested airspace or outside of robust radar coverage, you might be primarily responsible for navigating precisely along published airways using ground-based navigation needs like VORs, or perhaps navigating directly between waypoints using an IFR-certified GPS system.
And what's ATC's main role during that en route phase? Still separation?
Primarily, yes. ATC's main job en route is to maintain standard IFR separation between all known IFR aircraft operating within controlled airspace. However, it's important to remember that ATC does not issue IFR clearances or control flights in areas where they have no jurisdiction, which basically means outside a controlled airspace. So if your route takes you through uncontrolled airspace, there's no separation assurance provided by ATC in that segment.
Good distinction. Okay, let's switch gears now to the other end of the flight, getting back down onto the ground safely. Planning the descent and the actual instrument approach sounds like another phase where workload gets really high.
It definitely is. You could argue it's the most critical phase of the entire IFR flight. Many factors come into play here. The weather conditions at your destination, the current traffic situation, the status of your aircraft's equipment, and whether the approach control facility serving the airport is radar-equipped or not. All these influence the procedures you'll follow and significantly impact your workload in the cockpit.
How do you know ahead of time what kind of instrument approach to plan for? There can be several options at bigger airports.
That's true. At airports that have approach control services and multiple published instrument approach procedures, IAPs, you'll usually get information about the expected approach type well in advance of arrival.
How?
This might come via the ATIS broadcast, the automated weather and airport information recording, or the controller themselves might tell you, expect the ILS runway 27 approach, for example. If visibility is good, they might even say to expect vectors for a visual approach.
Is that expected approach a guarantee?
No, definitely not. That information is provided as a heads up to help you start planning and setting up your radios and instruments, but it's not a clearance, it's not a commitment, and it can definitely change based on traffic flow, weather, or runway changes. The handbook stresses that if the approach they suggest isn't suitable for you for some reason, maybe your equipment isn't working, or you'd prefer a different type, you must advise ATC immediately.
Okay. What if you're flying into an airport that doesn't have a control tower? How does that work?
It's a bit different. You'll need to monitor the automated weather service at the airport, like ASOS or AWOS, to get the current conditions yourself.
Right.
You then contact the overlying ATC facility, like center or approach control, and advise them that you have the current weather and what your intentions are usually, which specific instrument approach procedure you plan to fly.
What if you were on a cruise clearance coming in?
Good point. If you received a cruise clearance earlier, ATC won't issue you a separate, further clearance for the approach or landing. That cruise clearance already authorizes you to proceed to the airport and execute an approach. Once you've received your IFR clearance to the airport, or were on a cruise clearance, and have reported having the weather, the controller will likely clear you for the approach you requested, and then instruct you to change to the airport's advisory frequency, CTA.
And after that?
After you switch to the advisory frequency, you typically won't have any further contact with ATC until after you land and need to cancel your flight plan, usually by phone. You're responsible for making standard traffic calls on the CTAF, just like a VFR arrival.
Okay. And when should you start thinking about descending from your cruising altitude as you approach the destination?
You should definitely plan ahead and request your descent from ATC well before reaching the initial approach fix, the IAF, for the planned approach procedure, or before reaching a published transition route that leads you to the approach.
What if you're already on one of those transition routes?
If you're flying along a published transition route, like one depicted on an approach chart, you must maintain your last assigned altitude until ATC explicitly clears you for the approach itself, something like cleared ILS runway 19 approach. Only then can you descend according to the altitudes published on the transition route or the approach chart. You can, of course, always request lower altitudes from ATC earlier if you need or want them, perhaps due to icing, turbulence, or just to get down sooner.
ATC sometimes clears you to descend at pilot's discretion. What exactly does that phrase allow you to do?
Yeah, at pilot's discretion gives you a lot of flexibility. When you get that clearance, you can initiate the descent whenever you like. You can use any rate of descent you choose, fast or slow. And you can even level off temporarily at intermediate altitudes along the way down without advising ATC.
But there's a catch, right?
There is. The important restriction is once you have vacated an altitude while descending at pilot's discretion, you cannot return to that higher altitude without obtaining a new, amended clearance from ATC.
Got it. And if ATC just says descend and maintain 6,000 without the at pilot's discretion part,
then you're expected to begin your descent promptly upon acknowledging the clearance. You should use a reasonable rate of descent. The handbook suggests aiming for an optimum rate until you're about 1,000 feet above your assigned altitude, and then adjusting to a rate between 500 and 1,500 feet per minute for the last 1,000 feet to ensure a smooth level off.
Do you need to tell ATC if you can't descend very quickly?
Yes. If for any reason you're unable to maintain at least a 500 feet per minute rate of descent, you should advise ATC. Also, unless you're descending at pilot's discretion, you need to inform them if you have to level off temporarily at an intermediate altitude during the descent, unless it's for one of the standard reasons like needing to slow down below 10,000 feet MSL or within 2,500 feet of the airport elevation.
Okay. Now, similar to how there are departure procedures, DPs, are there standardized arrival procedures as well?
Yes, absolutely. Those are called Standard Terminal Arrival Routes, or STARs. Their purpose really mirrors that of DPs, but for the arrival phase of flight. They are designed to simplify clearance delivery for arriving aircraft, especially into busy, high-density terminal areas. They provide a standardized, efficient, and repeatable path from the en route structure down towards the initial approach fixes or vectors for the destination airport. Think of them as published arrival corridors.
Where can a pilot find these stars? Are they in the same place as approaches?
Yes, they're published in the TPPs, usually grouped together with the Instrument Approach Procedure IAP charts for a particular airport. They're also described conceptually in the Aeronautical Information Manual, the AIM.
So just like DPs, if there's a star for my arrival, I might get it in my clearance.
Exactly. If there are published stars serving your destination airport from the direction you're arriving, you may well be issued an arrival clearance that includes a specific star. For example, cleared to LAX via the CVIS 7 arrival.
And again, you need to have it handy.
Yes. You absolutely need to possess the current textual description or graphic chart for that specific star and understand its routing and altitude restrictions before you accept the clearance containing it.
What if you don't have it? Or maybe it involves a complex descent profile you're not equipped for?
Just like with DPs, you must advise ATC. You can indicate this by putting no star in the remarks section of your flight plan, or simply by telling the controller directly when they issue the clearance, unable CVIS 7 arrival. They will then issue you an alternative clearance, likely involving radar vectors or different routing. But remember, if you do accept a clearance containing a star, compliance with its published path and altitudes is mandatory, unless ATC amends it.
Makes sense. Sometimes, though, maybe due to traffic congestion ahead or weather over the airport, ATC needs you to delay your arrival sequence. That's when holding patterns come into play, right?
Exactly. A holding procedure is a predetermined maneuver, usually flown over a specific navigation fix, that's designed to keep an aircraft safely within a defined segment of airspace while it's waiting for further clearance from ATC. It's basically a way to park airplanes in the sky temporarily.
What does a standard holding pattern look like?
The standard holding pattern involves making right turns. If ATC needs you to make left turns for traffic flow or airspace reasons, it's called a non-standard pattern, and they will specifically state left turns in the holding instructions.
Okay, standard is right turns. How does the actual pattern work, assuming, perfect conditions with no wind?
Okay, in a standard pattern with no wind, you fly inbound along the specified course directly to the holding fix. Once you cross the fix, you initiate a 180-degree turn to the right. Then you fly outbound on a course parallel to the inbound course for a specific amount of time.
How long is that outbound leg?
The standard timing is 1 minute if you're holding at or below 14,000 feet MSL. You're holding above 14,000 feet MSL, the outbound leg is longer, 1.5 minutes.
Okay, 1 or 1.5 minutes out. Then what?
After flying outbound for the correct time, you make another 180-degree right turn. This turn should roll you back out onto the specified inbound course, which you then fly back to the holding fix, completing one circuit of the pattern.
But of course, wind is almost always a factor in reality. How do you compensate for that?
Yeah, wind compensation is absolutely essential to stay within the protected airspace of the holding pattern. You need to apply appropriate drift correction angles to both your inbound and outbound legs to try and maintain the desired ground track over the fix and along the courses.
And what about the timing?
The timing is critical too. The goal is to adjust the length of time you fly on your outbound leg so that your inbound leg, the leg where you're tracking back towards the fix, takes the correct standard time, either 1 minute or 1.5 minutes, depending on your altitude. So if you have a headwind inbound, you'll need a shorter outbound leg. If you have a tailwind inbound, you'll need a longer outbound leg. This ensures the overall size and shape of the pattern remains consistent and you stay protected.
Got it. So what information will ATC typically give you if they instruct you to hold?
Well, if there's a holding pattern already published on your chart for that fix, they might just say something simple like, hold northwest of the Podung VOR as published. Expect further clearance at 1550. If it's not a published pattern, or if they need you to hold somewhere specific, the clearance will be more detailed. It will typically include the direction you should hold from the fix, like hold west or hold southeast.
Yeah.
The name of the holding fix itself, though this might be omitted if the fix is simply your current clearance limit, the specific radial, course, bearing, airway, or route that defines the inbound leg of the pattern. The length of the holding leg, which might be specified in nautical miles if it's a DME or RNAV holding pattern, or otherwise assumed to be timed unless they state minutes. They'll also specify the direction of turns if it's non-standard, i.e. left turns. And crucially, they'll give you an expect further clearance time, or EFC time. That's the time you can expect to receive your next clearance out of holding.
That EFC time seems pretty important for planning.
It's vital. It tells you roughly how long you might be holding and allows you to manage fuel and expectations.
And are there standard ways you're supposed to actually enter a holding pattern when you first arrive at the fix? You can't just turn right into it, can you?
No, you can't. The AM details 3 standard entry procedures that are designed to ensure you enter the pattern smoothly and remain within the protected airspace during the entry maneuver. These are the parallel entry, the teardrop entry, and the direct entry.
How do you know which one to use?
It depends on the angle at which you approach the holding fix relative to the direction of the inbound holding course. The AMM provides diagrams showing which sector corresponds to which entry type. Generally, you select the procedure that requires the least amount of maneuvering to get established inbound.
And the turns during entry and in the pattern, any specifics there?
Yes. Turns should be made at a standard rate, which is 3 degrees per second, or using a bank angle of 30 degrees, or using the bank angle commanded by your flight director system, whichever of those requires the least bank angle.
Okay. Are there speed restrictions when you're flying in a holding pattern? Seems like going too fast could be a problem.
Definitely. There are published maximum holding airspeeds, or MHAs, that you must adhere to. The purpose is to prevent aircraft from flying too wide in the turns and potentially exiting the protected airspace, especially near other holding patterns.
What are the standard MHAs?
You should plan to start reducing your speed so that you cross the holding fix initially at or below the applicable MHA. The standard speeds are 200 knots indicated airspeed, KIS, for holding patterns up to 6,000 feet MSL, then 230 KIs for patterns from 6,001 feet up to 14,000 feet MSL, and 265 KIs for patterns of 14,001 feet MSL and above.
Are there exceptions?
Yes, there are a few. Some non-standard holding patterns might have lower speeds depicted on the chart, like 210 knots or even 175 knots for slower aircraft categories. Also, military airfields sometimes have higher standard holding speeds. The key is, if for any reason you cannot comply with the required holding speed, you must notify ATC.
Okay. Back to timing the legs once you're established in the pattern. How do you know exactly when to start timing that outbound leg?
Good question. You start timing the outbound leg when you are over, or abeam the holding fix, whichever occurs later.
Abeam the fix.
Yeah, abeam means when the fix is directly off your wingtip as you're rolling out onto the outbound heading. If you can't easily determine the abeam point, maybe due to winds or the type of navade, then you start timing when your turn to the outbound heading is complete.
Got it. Start timing over or abeam, whichever is later. And you adjust subsequent outbound legs based on the previous inbound time, right?
Exactly. After your initial entry and your first full circuit, you look at how long your inbound leg actually took. If it was shorter than the standard 1 or 1.5 minutes, you lengthen your next outbound leg. If it was longer, you shorten the next outbound leg. You keep adjusting until you bracket the timing to achieve the correct inbound leg duration.
Okay, makes sense. And when do you actually get to leave the holding pattern?
You leave holding when ATC issues you a further clearance. That might be a clearance for an instrument approach, or maybe a new en route segment to continue towards your destination, or an alternate.
Oh.
You would also leave holding as prescribed in the regulations, Part 91, if you experience a two-way radio communications failure and reach your EFC time or clearance limit. Or, of course, if you were holding in VFR conditions and decided to cancel your IFR flight plan.
Okay, holding covered. Let's get to the final, and maybe the most critical part of any IFR flight, the instrument approach procedures, the IAPs.
Right. These procedures, which are meticulously published on approach charts, provide the precise navigation guidance and, crucially, the obstruction clearance you need to safely descend from the en route structure down towards the airport environment, especially when you can't see the ground or runway clearly.
Many of these approaches seem to involve a procedure turn or some kind of course reversal to get lined up.
That's very common, yes. A procedure turn, often depicted as a barb symbol on the chart, is a maneuver designed to allow you to reverse course and get established inbound on the final approach course when arriving from certain directions. There are also other types of course reversals, like holding pattern in lieu of procedure turn entries.
But you mentioned earlier there are times you specifically don't do the procedure turn.
Correct. It's very important to know when not to execute a procedure turn or course reversal. The handbook lists several key situations. First, if the approach chart specifically depicts a no PT symbol along a particular feeder route or segment leading to the final approach course.
Okay, no PT means no procedure turn.
Right. Second, if ATC is providing radar vectors to intercept the final approach course, they are aligning you, so no reversal is needed. Third, if the approach procedure uses a published holding pattern in lieu of a procedure turn, you fly the holding pattern entry and pattern as depicted. Fourth, if you are executing a timed approach from a holding fix, we discussed those earlier. And fifth, simply if ATC specifically directs you otherwise, may be telling you cleared straight-in approach.
Got it. Lots of exceptions. There seem to be quite a few different types of instrument approaches based on the navigation equipment they rely on.
Yes, the technology has evolved over the years, so we have a variety. The handbook lists the main categories. You have NDB approaches using non-directional beacons, VOR approaches using VHF omnidirectional range stations, sometimes combined as VORTAC or VORNAM, if distance information is also used.
Okay, older tech.
Somewhat, yeah. Then you have localizer, LOC approaches, which provide lateral guidance. The ILS, or Instrument Landing System, which adds a vertical glide slope to the localizer for precision guidance. LDA, Localizer Type Directional Aid, and SDF, Simplified Directional Facility Approaches, are similar to localizers but might not be aligned with the runway. And increasingly common are RNAV approaches, including GPS approaches, which use area navigation systems, typically satellite-based GPS, for both lateral and sometimes vertical guidance, LPV or LNAV, VNAV.
So lots of flavors. And you can typically fly an approach in a couple of different ways, depending on the airport setup and what ATC is doing.
Right. Broadly speaking, there are two main ways to execute a published IAP. You can fly a full approach, sometimes called flying the full procedure. This means you navigate yourself using all the published routes, turns, and altitudes depicted on the approach chart, starting from a published initial approach fix, IAF, or feeder route, with minimal assistance from ATC beyond the initial clearance for the approach.
When would you do that?
This is common at airports that don't have radar approach control services, or perhaps if you've experienced a radio communication failure and need to fly the approach autonomously based on your last clearance.
Relay.
The other, and often more common method, especially at busier airports with radar, is to receive radar vectors from approach control. In this case, ATC gives you specific headings and altitudes to fly that maneuver you into a position to smoothly intercept the final approach course, usually somewhere outside the final approach fix, FAF.
So they guide you onto the final path.
Exactly. Once you report established on the final approach course, ATC typically stops giving you vectors, and you take over navigating the final segment using the published procedure on the chart and your onboard instruments. This method is usually more efficient for ATC as it allows them to sequence arriving aircraft more tightly. So if you're in radar contact approaching an airport, you should generally expect to receive vectors to final.
Okay, let's break down the specific approach process, maybe based on the type of airport you're flying into. First, what about landing at an airport that doesn't have an operating control tower, an uncontrolled field?
Right. Approaching an uncontrolled airport under IFR requires careful coordination. You'll need to monitor the airport's automated weather source, like AWOS or ASOS if available, to get the current conditions. You then contact the overlying ATC facility, center or approach, and inform them you have the weather, and state your intentions, specifically which instrument approach procedure you plan to fly, since there might be multiple options.
Okay.
The controller will then issue your clearance for that specific instrument approach. If you were previously on a cruise clearance, remember, you won't get a separate approach clearance. You're already authorized.
Yeah.
ATC will typically instruct you to change to the airport's Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, CTF, at a certain point or distance.
And after that frequency change?
After you switch to the advisory frequency, you generally have no further required contact with ATC until after you land. You are responsible for making position reports and stating your intentions on the CTAF, just like any VFR aircraft arriving at an uncontrolled field, to alert other traffic. And crucially, you must remember to cancel your IFR flight plan after landing, usually by calling FSS or ATC via phone. The handbook also stresses that when flying an approach to an uncontrolled field, you must execute the complete published IAP unless you have specific authorization from ATC to do otherwise. No shortcuts.
Got it. Okay, scenario 2. An airport that has an operating control tower but no dedicated approach control radar facility nearby. How does that work?
In that situation, the overlying ATC facility, like center, Might clear you directly to an outer fix or a navigation aid near the airport that serves as an IAF for an approach. They'll give you an altitude to maintain until that fix, possibly issue holding instructions there if needed for traffic spacing, and tell you who to contact next, which will likely be the airport tower itself.
So you talk directly to the tower controller?
Usually, yes. You'd monitor the airport's ATIS for weather and other information, or get it directly from the tower controller if there's no ATIS. You'd likely fly the full approach procedure yourself, using the chart, navigating for that outer fix inbound. The tower controller would then provide wind information, runway conditions, and ultimately issue your landing clearance.
Okay. And the third, likely busiest scenario, an airport that has both an operating tower and approach control radar services.
This is where radar vectoring becomes the standard operating procedure for arrivals. Approach control uses radar to sequence traffic efficiently and position you onto the final approach course for the active runway. They'll issue you specific headings to fly and altitudes to maintain to provide safe separation from other aircraft.
And you just follow those headings?
Yes. You should not deviate from assigned radar headings unless it's absolutely necessary for safety, and if you do, you must advise ATC immediately. They will normally inform you if they are vectoring you across the final approach course, perhaps to give you more room to get established. If you think you're about to cross the final and haven't been told, it's wise to query the controller.
And you don't turn inbound on your own?
Critically, no. You do not turn inbound onto the final approach course unless and until you are explicitly cleared for the approach by ATC. This clearance is usually issued concurrently with the final vector they give you that will intercept the final approach course, typically a few miles outside the final approach fix, FAF.
So something like turn right heading in 180, maintain 3000 until established, cleared, ILS runway 19 approach.
Exactly like that. Once you receive that clearance and are established on the final approach course, meaning your CDI is centering, you transition your focus. You use the designated navigation aid for that specific approach, the ILS, the VOR, the GPS display, as your primary means of navigation from that point onward.
Does ATC stop watching you then?
No, they continue to provide radar separation from other IFR traffic behind you or on parallel approaches. But you are responsible for flying the published course and altitudes depicted on the final approach segment of the chart. After you pass the FAF, you continue inbound towards the airport to land, or if you don't meet the requirements to land, like visibility or runway insight, you execute the published missed approach procedure.
When does radar service end?
Radar service provided by approach control automatically terminates either when you land or the approach is to an uncontrolled field when they instruct you to change to the advisory frequency.
Okay, that covers the standard approach as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, radar approaches sound like a completely different category, where the controller is essentially talking you down based entirely on their radar screen. Is that right?
Pretty much, yes. In a true radar approach, the controller monitored your aircraft's position very precisely on their radar display and provides you with continuous verbal instructions for both course, azimuth, and sometimes altitude elevation guidance to get you aligned with the runway.
When would these be used?
They can be requested by a pilot, perhaps in an emergency situation like a complete navigation equipment failure. Or ATC might offer them sometimes to expedite traffic flow if the controllers and equipment are available. The beauty is, all you technically need in the aircraft is a functioning radio transmitter and receiver.
What are the main types of radar approaches?
There are two primary types mentioned in the handbook. The most precise is the Precision Approach Radar, or PAR. This provides the controller with highly accurate information on both your lateral position relative to the runway centerline and your vertical position relative to the ideal glide slope. They use this to give you very precise heading and descent instructions.
Like a verbal ILS?
Very much like that, yes. The second type is the Surveillance Approach Radar, or ASR. This provides the controller with guidance information for your azimuth left-right position only. They can keep you lined up with the runway centerline, but they don't have precise glide slope information. Because of this, PARs typically have lower weather minimums, a decision height, than ASRs, which have higher minimums, a minimum descent altitude. You find the specific radar minimums published separately in the TPPs.
So for a PAR, the controller is really walking you through it, telling you exactly when to descend.
They are. The controller gives you continuous heading adjustments to keep you precisely on the extended runway centerline. They anticipate when you should intercept the electronic glide slope and tell you, usually 10-30 seconds beforehand, prepare to begin descent and then begin descent. They monitor your position closely relative to the ideal path and advise you of any deviations, using standard terms like slightly above below glide path, well above below, and sometimes trend information like coming down rapidly or drifting left slowly.
Do they tell you how far you are?
Yes, they typically provide your distance from the touchdown point each mile. If your aircraft deviates significantly from the safe course or glide path limits, and you report not having the runway environment in sight, the controller will direct you to execute a missed approach. The guidance continues down to the published decision height, DH. Even after the DH, they may provide advisory information about your position relative to the center line until you're practically over the runway threshold.
And an ASR is less precise because there's no vertical guidance from the controller.
Correct. An ASR provides azimuth guidance only just headings to keep you aligned with the runway centerline. Because it lacks the precision vertical guidance of a PAR, it have higher minimums, an MDA instead of a DH. The controller doesn't give you glide slope information, but they will advise you when to begin your descent to the minimum descent altitude, MDA, and if applicable, any minimum crossing altitudes, MCAs, at step-down fixes along the final. They also advise you of your position each mile from the missed approach point, MAP, or the runway threshold.
Can they give you any altitude suggestions?
Yes. On request, the controller can provide recommended altitudes down to the MDA based on a standard descent gradient for your position, but these are advisory only. The guidance typically continues until you reach the MAP.
What happens if your aircraft's directional gyro or primary compass system isn't working accurately? Can you still attempt a radar approach?
Yes, that's a great point. You can request a no-gyro approach from ATC if you have that kind of failure. You just advise the controller request no-gyro vectors or request no-gyro ASR approach. The controller will then give you verbal turn instructions like turn right, wait for you to establish the turn, and then stop turn, anticipating the rollout heading. They'll instruct you to make standard rate turns during most of the vectoring, but switch to half standard rate turns when you're on the final approach segment for finer control.
Can ATC also use their radar to sort of look over your shoulder while you're flying a different type of instrument approach, like an ILS or VOR, even if it's not technically a radar approach?
Yes, they can. Some facilities, often joint civil military airports equipped with PAR, can provide radar monitoring services for standard instrument approaches. They might do this when the weather is below basic VFR minimums at night, or if a pilot specifically requests it.
Is it primary guidance then?
No, it's explicitly considered a secondary aid. Your primary navigation must still come from the ILS, VOR, or GPS signals you're tracking. ATC will advise you if they are providing monitoring and if the service isn't available. They can still provide helpful information, though, like confirming you've passed the final approach fix, giving you trend advisories if you start to drift off course or glide path, and they can even advise you to execute a missed approach if they see you deviate significantly outside safety limits and you don't have the runway in sight.
Interesting backup. Okay, moving on to a few other specific approach types mentioned. What are timed approaches? When are they used?
Timed approaches from a holding fix are a procedure used primarily when there's a high volume of aircraft arriving, all waiting for approach clearance, maybe more than can fit in the holding pattern easily. Instead of just holding indefinitely until it's your turn, you might be assigned a specific time to depart the holding fix or the final approach fix inbound on the approach course.
So they sequence you by time.
Exactly. You get advance notice from ATC like expect to depart the fix at 1625. You then adjust your flight path within the holding pattern, maybe shortening or lengthening legs slightly to arrive over the fix, ready to depart inbound as close to that designated time as possible. This allows ATC to integrate you smoothly into a time sequence with other arriving aircraft.
Are there specific conditions required for ATC to use timed approaches?
Yes. The handbook lists several conditions that must be met. The airport must have an operating control tower. You need to have direct radio communication with the center or approach controller until they instruct you to contact the tower. And there are specific criteria regarding the configuration of the missed approach point, MAP, and whether the approach requires a course reversal, depending on the weather conditions relative to circling minimums.
And a key takeaway you mentioned earlier.
Right. When you are cleared for a timed approach, you should not execute a procedure turn, even if one is depicted on the chart. The timing sequence replaces the need for that reversal maneuver.
Got it. Parallel runways and low visibility conditions. That seems inherently complex and maybe a bit nerve-wracking. How does ATC handle that?
It is complex, and the procedures are designed with multiple layers of safety. You can conduct simultaneous independent ILS approaches to parallel runways, provided they are separated by at least 4,300 feet up to 9,000 feet. This requires specialized radar monitoring, including dedicated final monitor controllers whose sole job is to watch radar displays focused only on the final approach courses, ensuring aircraft don't stray too close to the adjacent runway's path. There are also dependent approaches allowed to runways spaced closer together, down to 2,500 feet, but they require specific spacing between aircraft on the adjacent approaches.
How do you know if simultaneous approaches are happening?
Approach charts for airports where these operations are authorized will include a specific note, like simultaneous approaches authorize RWYS 14L and 14R. Controllers will also typically advise pilots when simultaneous approaches are in use.
What's crucial for the pilot in that situation?
This type of operation demands extremely heightened pilot situational awareness. You need to be absolutely meticulous about verifying the correct localizer frequency for your assigned runway, double-checking the runway identifier, and strictly complying with all ATC clearances and instructions. Precise radio discipline is also key. Monitor your frequency carefully, avoid unnecessary chatter, and you must immediately advise approach control if you experience any malfunction of your navigation or communication equipment during the approach.
Okay, what about a sidestep maneuver? What's that?
This is a specific procedure that ATC can authorize when landing on closely spaced parallel runways separated by 1,200 feet or less. You are cleared for a specified non-precision approach, like a localizer or VOR approach, that's aligned with one of the runways, but the clearance includes an instruction to land on the adjacent parallel runway.
So you fly the approach for one runway but land on the other?
Essentially, yes. The clearance would sound something like, cleared ILS runway 7 left approach, sidestep to runway 7 right. You fly the instrument approach procedure down to near minimums. As soon as you acquire visual reference to the runway environment and can positively identify the adjacent runway you're supposed to land on, you commence the sidestep maneuver, a short lateral shift to align with that runway for landing.
Are the minimums the same?
No, the landing minimums authorized for a sidestep maneuver are based on non-precision approach criteria. This means they are generally higher than the precision minimums you might have had for the primary approach runway, but they're usually lower than the standard circling minimums would be for that airport.
Okay, that leads us nicely into circling approaches. When do those come into play?
The circling approach is necessary when you can successfully complete an instrument approach to an airport, but you can't make a straight-in landing from that approach. This could be because the final approach course isn't aligned closely enough with any runway, more than 30 degrees off. Or maybe the wind strongly favors landing on a different runway than the one the instrument approach leads to.
So you fly the instrument approach, break out visually, and then maneuver to land on a different runway.
Exactly. The minimums listed under the circling category on the approach chart apply in this situation. These minimums are designed to provide at least 300 feet of obstacle clearance within a defined circling area radius around the airport. That radius varies depending on your aircraft's approach category, speed.
How do you fly a circling approach safely? It sounds like it could get disorienting in marginal weather.
It absolutely requires careful technique and constant vigilance. The fundamental rules are: you must maintain visual contact with the airport environment, specifically the runway you intend to land on, throughout the entire circling maneuver. And you must fly no lower than the published circling minimum altitude, MDA, until you are continuously in a position from which you can make a normal descent to land on the intended runway using normal maneuvers.
Any tips for doing it safely?
The handbook actually suggests that if the ceiling permits, it's often safer and provides better perspective to fly the circling maneuver at a slightly higher altitude than the absolute minimum MDA, perhaps closer to the normal VFR traffic pattern altitude for that airport, while still ensuring you remain at or above the required circling MDA. And crucially, you must maneuver your aircraft so that you remain within the designated circling area radius shown on the approach chart for your category. Don't stray outside that protected zone. The pilot really has to consider many factors: the airport layout, the actual ceiling and visibility, wind direction and speed, how the final approach course lines up, the distance from the FAF, and any ATC instructions when planning and executing the circling maneuver.
Okay, so whether it's a straight-in, sidestep, or circling approach, you've flown the procedure, you're getting close to the published minimum altitude. What are the absolute hard and fast rules that dictate whether you can actually continue below that minimum altitude and land, or if you must execute a missed approach?
This is arguably the most critical regulation in all of instrument flying, found in 14 CFR 91.175. It states very clearly that you cannot operate your aircraft below the authorized minimum descent altitude, MDA, for a non-precision approach, Or continue your descent below the authorized decision altitude or decision height, DADH, for a precision approach, unless three specific conditions are met simultaneously.
Three conditions. Okay, what are they?
Condition number one. The aircraft must be continuously in a position from which you can make a normal descent to a landing on the intended runway, using normal rates of descent and normal maneuvers. Basically, you have to be stable and properly positioned to land without any drastic or unsafe actions.
Makes sense. Condition two.
Condition two. The flight visibility, which is what you, the pilot, can actually see from the cockpit, must not be less than the visibility prescribed in the standard instrument approach procedure you are currently using.
So it's explicitly about what the pilot sees out the window, not just what the weather report or ATIS said maybe 10 minutes ago.
It's exactly right. While ATC or automated weather systems provide reported visibility, like prevailing visibility, runway visual value, RVV, or runway visual range, RVR, the regulation hinges on flight visibility. Only the pilot can determine if the visibility they are actually experiencing meets or exceeds the minimums published on the approach chart. If your flight visibility is less than the prescribed minimum, you must execute a missed approach, even if the reported visibility was technically above minimums.
Okay, so position normally and flight visibility meets the requirement. What's the third condition?
The third condition is that at least one of a specific list of visual references for the intended runway must be distinctly visible and identifiable to the pilot.
You have to see something specific that tells you where the runway is. What references count according to the rules?
The handbook, reflecting the regulation, provides the official list. These references include the approach light system. However, if you only see the approach lights, you can only descend down to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation until you see other required references.
Okay, approach lights get you partway down. What else?
The threshold of the runway, the threshold markings, the threshold lights, the runway end identifier lights, those flashing strobes at the runway end, often called reels, the visual approach slope indicator like VSI or PPI lights, the touchdown zone or the touchdown zone markings, the touchdown zone lights, the runway itself or the runway markings, or the runway edge lights.
So if you're properly positioned, have the required flight visibility, and you clearly see any one of those specific visual references, besides just the approach lights alone below 100 feet, you can legally continue the descent below the MDA or DADH towards landing.
That's correct. If all three conditions are met, you proceed. If any one of those three conditions is not met when you reach the MDA or DADH, or if you lose the required visual reference or visibility after descending below minimums, you must immediately execute the missed approach.
Got it. Now, what happens if some of the equipment or visual aids that the approach relies on, like maybe the approach lights or part of the ILS system, are actually inoperative? Does that change the minimums?
Yes, absolutely. The minimums published directly on the main body of the approach chart assume that all the required components of that approach are fully functional. If certain components are reported as inoperative, you are usually required to use higher minimums, meaning you need better visibility or a higher ceiling to legally start or continue the approach.
How do you know what the higher minimums are?
The handbook gives an example. If the main approach light system, like an ALSF1, is reported inoperative for an ILS approach, the required visibility minimum typically needs to be increased, often by a quarter or a half mile, depending on the specifics. If multiple components are inoperative, you must apply the penalty that results in the highest required minimum visibility or altitude. For instance, if the ILS glide slope is reported inoperative, the entire approach essentially becomes a non-precision localizer approach, and you must use the published localizer, LOC minimums, which will have a higher MDA and usually higher visibility requirement than the original ILS minimums.
Where do you find these adjustments?
You consult the Inoperative Components or Visual Aids table, which is usually found right inside the front cover of the U.S. Terminal Procedures Publication, TPP, booklet for that region. It lists various components and the corresponding adjustments to make to the published minimums. Checking this table against current NOTAM's reporting outages is a critical pre-approach step.
Okay, so if those conditions for landing aren't met when you reach minimums, or if maybe ATC tells you to go around or something just doesn't look right, you have to execute a missed approach.
Right. The missed approach procedure is your pre-planned safety net. It's a defined procedure, published both textually and graphically right there on the approach chart, designed to guide you safely from the missed approach point, MAP, or the decision height, DH, back up into the airway structure while ensuring you remain clear of all obstacles.
Seems like something you'd want to review carefully before you start the approach.
Oh, absolutely. The handbook strongly advises pilots to study and master the details of the missed approach procedure, the initial heading or track, the climb altitude, any subsequent turns or fixes before they even begin flying the instrument approach itself. Why? Because workload is incredibly high at the moment you have to make the decision to go missed. You need to know exactly what to do instinctively.
What are the basic steps involved in actually executing a missed approach when you make that call?
The sequence is usually pretty standard, though you tailor it to your specific aircraft. Immediately, establish the proper pitch attitude for a climb in your aircraft. Smoothly apply climb power. Configure the aircraft for climb, usually retracting flaps incrementally, raising the landing gear if applicable. Then, make the initial turn, if required, towards the heading or track specified in the published missed approach procedure. As soon as workload permits, advise ATC that you are executing the missed approach. And finally, request further clearance from ATC regarding what you want to do next. Maybe try the same approach again, request a different approach, proceed to your alternate airport, or enter a holding pattern.
What if you decide to go missed before you actually reach the published missed approach point on a non-precision approach, or before reaching the decision altitude height on a precision approach? Maybe you lose sight early or just aren't stable.
That's an important point of procedure. Unless ATC has specifically cleared you otherwise, the rule is you must continue flying the instrument approach procedure laterally as published all the way to the MEP while maintaining altitude at or above the minimum descent altitude, MDA, or continue to the decision altitude or decision height, DADH, before you begin any turn specified in the missed approach procedure instructions.
So fly to the MEP first, then turn. Wait.
It ensures you remain within the protected airspace designed for the final approach segment right up until the MAP, where the missed approach obstacle protection surface begins. Starting your turn early could potentially put you outside that protected area.
Got it. And what if you lose sight of the runway environment while you're in the middle of a circling maneuver?
That's another critical situation where you must immediately execute the missed approach procedure for the original instrument approach you flew to get into the circling situation. The specific initial maneuver is important here. You make an initial climbing turn towards the landing runway you were circling for. This ensures you turn back toward the known airport environment initially for obstacle clearance in that immediate area. Then, you continue the climb and maneuver as necessary to intercept and fly the published missed approach course depicted on the chart.
Okay. The handbook specifically lists a few trigger situations where you must immediately execute the missed approach. Can you recap those for us?
Yes, these are the non-negotiable triggers for hitting the go-around button, essentially. 1. Whenever those 3 requirements for operating below the DADH or MDA, position normally required flight V's runway reference in sight, are not met when you are operating below the MDA or upon your arrival at the MAP, and really any time after that point until you actually touch down safely. 2, whenever you lose sight of an identifiable part of the airport environment while you are performing a circling maneuver at or above the circling MDA, if you lose sight, you go missed.
Right.
And 3, very simply, whenever you are directed to do so by air traffic control, if they say go around, you go around immediately and fly the published missed approach, advising them you're doing so.
Clear triggers. Okay, shifting perspective a bit.
Yeah.
Beyond just the procedures, flying IFR often means dealing with actual instrument weather conditions, clouds, low visibility, maybe turbulence or icing. How does general pilot experience factor into handling this?
Well, quite naturally, more flying experience, both VFR and IFR in a variety of conditions, helps build proficiency, judgment, and importantly, confidence in trusting your instruments when you can't see outside. The handbook makes a couple of interesting points here. It notes that extensive VFR experience, particularly in busy, high-traffic terminal areas, actually helps develop better visual scanning techniques, which are still important in IFR for monitoring instruments and looking for traffic when possible.
And night flying.
Night flying, especially on moonless nights or over unlit areas where there's no visible horizon, is considered excellent practice for building instrument proficiency. It really forces you to rely solely on your flight instruments and reinforces the discipline needed to trust them over potentially misleading physiological sensations or visual cues.
And just staying current and proficient specifically in IFR.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Federal regulations, Part 91, specifies certain minimum requirements for recent IFR experience, like flying a certain number of approaches, holding procedures, and course tracking within the preceding 6 months to legally file and fly IFR. But the handbook emphasizes these are just minimums. True proficiency requires flying IFR regularly, practicing various procedures frequently, and ideally flying with a safety pilot or getting recurrent training with a qualified instrument instructor periodically to maintain sharp skills and good habits.
What are the main weather hazards that an IFR pilot really needs to be prepared to contend with, maybe more so than a VFR pilot?
Well, beyond the obvious low ceilings and visibility that define instrument conditions, the big weather hazards that pose significant risks, specifically to IFR flight, are thunderstorms, turbulence, especially severe turbulence, and structural icing.
Let's take turbulence first. How do you deal with that when you're inside a cloud?
Turbulence can range from just light chop that's annoying, to moderate bumps, to severe or even extreme turbulence that can potentially cause loss of control or structural damage. Avoiding areas of known or forecast severe turbulence is paramount. This starts with a thorough pre-flight weather briefing, paying close attention to sources like SIGMETs, significant meteorological information, convective SIGMETs, airmets, airmen's meteorological information, especially airmet tango for turbulence, PIREPs, pilot reports, and various forecast discussions.
What are the visual clues, if any?
Visually, even from a distance before entering clouds, you should be wary of clouds showing significant vertical development, like towering cumulus clouds, TCU, and especially cumulonimbus clouds, CBs, which indicate strong convective activity. Also, be aware of standing lenticular clouds, often found downwind of mountains, which are a classic sign of mountain wave activity and potentially severe turbulence.
And once you're flying?
In flight, you keep monitoring weather information through services like HIWAS, Hazardous In-Flight Weather Advisory Service, broadcast over VORs, or by contacting flight service stations, FSS, or Flight Watch, en route Flight Advisory Service, for the latest PRs from aircraft ahead of you or in your area.
Thunderstorms seem like the biggest threat overall.
They really are, because they often contain a whole package of hazards simultaneously. Severe turbulence, large hail, heavy rain, reducing visibility, lightning, strong updrafts and downdrafts, and significant icing potential. The standard avoidance guidance is crucial. Circumnavigate any identified or suspected thunderstorm cell by at least 20 nautical miles, especially if you don't have onboard weather radar to see the intensity course.
What about flying over or under them?
Flying over the top is sometimes an option, but the handbook suggests flying at least 1,000 feet above the storm top for every 10 knots of wind speed at that altitude to stay clear of turbulence generated above the visible cloud. And you should never attempt to fly underneath a thunderstorm, as that's often where the most severe downdrafts and hail can be found. The handbook strongly emphasizes that there's no reliable correlation between a storm's visual appearance from the outside and the severity of the hazards within it. Treat all thunderstorms as extremely hazardous, particularly those with reported tops above 35,000 feet.
Does onboard radar help pinpoint the worst parts?
Yes. Onboard weather radar is a valuable tool, but it primarily shows areas of precipitation, not turbulence directly. However, areas of heavier precipitation, shown as stronger radar returns, often yellow or red, indicate areas of strong convection and are highly correlated with moderate to severe turbulence and other hazards. The guidance is still to avoid flying through or even near strong radar echoes. Even flying between echoes that are less than about 20-30 miles apart might not guarantee a smooth ride.
Lightning is also a factor?
Yes. Lightning is a significant hazard associated with thunderstorms. The probability of encountering lightning is highest in areas where the temperature is between -5 degrees C and +5 degrees C, and it can occur even in clear air adjacent to a storm cell. Avoidance is always the best policy.
Okay, let's say despite your best efforts, you unexpectedly fly into significant turbulence. What's the recommended procedure according to the handbook?
Right. If you encounter moderate or severe turbulence, the immediate actions are focused on maintaining control of the aircraft and minimizing stress on the airframe. First, immediately reduce power and slow the aircraft down to its recommended turbulence penetration speed, or maneuvering speed, if a specific penetration speed isn't published. This speed is found in your POA-AFM.
Why slow down?
Slowing down reduces the aerodynamic loads imposed on the aircraft structure by sharp gusts, lessening the risk of structural damage. Second, concentrate on keeping the wings level and maintaining a constant pitch attitude. Critically, the handbook emphasizes do not chase altitude. Allow the aircraft's altitude to fluctuate with the updrafts and downdrafts. Trying to fight it by making large pitch inputs to hold a precise altitude dramatically increases the stress on the aircraft and the pilot's workload.
So accept the altitude changes.
Yes. Maintain a constant power setting that corresponds to your target turbulence penetration speed in level flight. Advise ATC as soon as possible about the turbulence encounter, its intensity, and the fact that you may be deviating from your assigned altitude. You can request a block altitude clearance for, maintain block altitude 6,000 through 8,000 if needed to give you more room to maneuver vertically. And again, PIREPs are invaluable here, both receiving them and providing them after your encounter. Okay, the next big weather hazard, structural icing. That sounds particularly dangerous.
It is, because ice accumulating on the aircraft's exterior surfaces can severely degrade aerodynamic performance, increase weight and drag, and potentially lead to loss of control. Structural icing occurs when you fly through visible moisture like clouds, fog, or precipitation, and the outside air temperature is at or below 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also important to remember that aerodynamic cooling over the wing and other surfaces can actually cause ice to form, even when the ambient air temperature is slightly above freezing, maybe +1 degree C or +2 degrees C. Are there different types of ice?
Yes. The handbook describes 3 main types. Rime ice typically forms from small, supercooled water droplets freezing very quickly on impact. It usually appears rough, milky white and porous, and tends to build up on leading edges. Clear ice forms from larger supercooled water droplets, like those found in freezing rain or cumuliform clouds, that spread out over the surface before freezing slowly. It's often smooth, transparent, and very hard to see, but it's particularly dangerous because it can significantly change the actual shape of the airfoil, disrupting lift dramatically. And then there's mixed ice, which is simply a combination of rime and clear ice, often forming rough, irregular shapes that can accumulate very rapidly.
If you realize you're starting to pick up structural ice, what's the immediate action you must take?
The handbook is very direct about this. Structural icing conditions generally only get worse if you remain in them. Your very first action must be to get out of the visible moisture immediately. This means taking decisive action to change your flight path. Descend below the cloud bases if possible, climb above the cloud tops if feasible and authorized, or make a turn to a different course to exit the area of clouds or precipitation where the icing is occurring.
What if you can't get out of the clouds easily?
If leaving the visible moisture isn't an immediate option, your next priority should be to move to an altitude where the air temperature is safely above freezing. Report encountering icing conditions to ATC immediately. Tell them the type and intensity, trace, light, moderate, severe, and request a new routing or an altitude change to exit the icing conditions as quickly as possible. Providing timely PIREPs about icing is critical for other aircraft.
Okay. Fog. Seems straightforward, just low visibility.
Mostly, yes. Fog is essentially a cloud that's formed at or very near the ground surface, reducing horizontal visibility, sometimes to near zero. The main challenge with fog is anticipating the conditions that lead to its formation, primarily when the air temperature cools down to meet the dew point temperature, reaching saturation. This often happens around dawn or dusk, or when moist air moves over a cooler surface.
So planning is key.
Absolutely. When fog is forecast or likely at your destination or alternate, you need to plan your fuel reserves very carefully and ensure your chosen alternate is forecast to remain well above minimums. En route, stay alert to changing conditions by monitoring ATIS or Savatios broadcasts from airports ahead. A small temperature dew point spread, say 5 degrees Fahrenheit or about 2-3 degrees Celsius or less, is a big warning sign that fog could form or thicken rapidly.
Volcanic ash. That sounds like something out of a disaster movie, but the handbook mentions it. How serious is it?
It's extremely rare for most pilots to encounter, thankfully. But it is profoundly dangerous if you do fly into a volcanic ash cloud. It's not just smoke. It's a cloud of very fine, highly abrasive silica particles, basically pulverized rock and glass, and volcanic gases. This abrasive dust can cause rapid, severe engine damage, potentially leading to multiple engine failures on jet aircraft. It can also severely pit cockpit windscreens, reducing or eliminating forward visibility, and clog the pit static system, leading to unreliable airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed indications.
Can you see it or detect it easily?
That's part of the danger. You can be very difficult to distinguish visually from ordinary weather clouds, especially at night or when embedded within other cloud layers. Airborne weather radar is also generally ineffective at detecting volcanic ash clouds because the particles are too fine.
Are there any signs if you inadvertently enter one?
Yes. Pilots who have encountered ash have reported several distinct signs. Dust or smoke appearing in the cabin, a strong odor similar to electrical smoke or sulfur, occurrences of St. Elmo's fire, static discharge, around the windscreen or wings, obviously pitted windscreens, and sudden engine or instrument malfunctions.
How do you avoid it?
Avoidance is absolutely critical. Every effort must be made to avoid flying into areas where volcanic ash might be present. This involves careful pre-flight planning, checking for volcanic activity reports, and SIGMATs for ash along your route. Plan flights to remain significantly upwind of any recently active volcanoes. Relying on visual detection or radar is just not reliable.
What if you see an eruption or encounter ash?
You should immediately report it via PIREP. This information is crucial for alerting other aircraft and forecasting agencies. The National Weather Service monitors ash clouds and issues specific volcanic ash segments, and specialized VAFTAD charts are available that provide forecasts of ash cloud locations and dispersion patterns.
Okay, one more major weather hazard often discussed, especially during approach and departure. Wind shear.
Yes, wind shear is a significant concern, particularly at low altitudes during takeoff and landing, because it can cause rapid and unexpected changes in aircraft performance when you have little altitude or time to react. Wind shear is simply defined as a change in wind speed and/or direction over a relatively short distance, which can occur horizontally across the ground, vertically with altitude, or both.
Where does it typically occur?
It can be associated with several weather phenomena. Thunderstorms, especially near gust fronts or microbursts, low-level temperature inversions, where cold air is trapped beneath warmer air, the jet stream, though usually at higher altitudes, and frontal passages, where different air masses meet.
How does it affect an aircraft on approach, for example?
It depends on the type of shear. If you encounter a sudden increase in headwind or a decrease in tailwind, your airspeed will momentarily increase and the aircraft's nose will tend to pitch up, causing you to potentially balloon above the desired glide slope. Conversely, if you encounter a sudden decrease in headwind or an increase in tailwind, or worse, a downdraft, your airspeed will decrease, the nose will tend to pitch down, and the aircraft will tend to sink below the glide slope.
What's the most dangerous scenario?
The most dangerous classic wind shear scenario is encountering a strong headwind shear initially, followed quickly by a strong tailwind shear and/or a downdraft, particularly when you're close to the ground on final approach. If the pilot reacts to the initial headwind shear by reducing power and lowering the nose to stay on glide slope, they can then be caught suddenly with low power and a low nose attitude just as the tailwind or downdraft hits, potentially leading to an unrecoverable sink rate near the ground.
So what's the defense against wind shear?
Primarily, awareness and avoidance if possible, and being prepared for immediate action. Be alert for any indications of potential wind shear early in the approach, things like large airspeed fluctuations, unusual pitch attitude requirements to maintain glide slope, or rapid changes in ground speed shown on GPS. Be absolutely ready to initiate a missed approach or go around immediately if you suspect or encounter significant wind shear. At low altitudes, recovery may be impossible.
Are there systems to help detect it?
Yes, some larger airports are equipped with low-level wind shear alert systems, LLWAS, or more advanced radar-based systems. These systems detect significant wind discrepancies around the airport and automatically provide alerts to air traffic controllers. The controller will then issue a specific alert to affected aircraft, something like runway 27 arrival, wind shear alert, expect 20-knot loss on 3-mile final, threshold wind 200 at 15. This gives you a specific warning about the type and location of the expected airspeed change.
And again, PIREPs are important. It's very important. Pilots encountering wind shear are strongly encouraged to report it via PIREP, detailing the location, for example, on final approach, altitude, the type of shear, airspeed gain or loss, and the intensity. This helps warn following aircraft.
Okay, before we wrap everything up with that detailed example flight walkthrough, there are two terms that often get confused because they sound similar, but the handbook clarifies they're quite different. VFR on top versus VFR over the top. Can we nail down that distinction?
Absolutely. It's a common point of confusion, but the distinction is critical legally and procedurally. Let's start with VFR on top. VFR on top is actually an IFR clearance.
Okay, it's IFR. Yes. It's a clearance specifically requested by a pilot who is operating on an IFR flight plan but is currently in, or expects to encounter, VFR, visual meteorological conditions. It authorizes that pilot, while still on the IFR flight plan, to select a VFR cruising altitude or flight level of their choice, subject to any ATC restrictions, instead of being assigned a specific IFR altitude. You can even request a VFR on-top clearance specifically to climb through a cloud layer to reach VFR conditions above it.
So you're flying under IFR rules overall, but choosing your own VFR altitude because you're in VFR conditions.
Precisely. When you accept and operate under a VFR on-top clearance, you gain that flexibility in altitude selection, which can be nice for finding smoother air or better winds. However, you still retain significant responsibilities. You must fly at an appropriate VFR altitude or flight level based on your magnetic course, as required by 14 CFR Part 91 for VFR flight. You must also comply with VFR visibility and distance from cloud requirements specified in Part 91.
But you're still IFR in other ways.
Yes. Crucially, you must continue to comply with all the other IFR rules that are applicable to your flight. This includes things like adhering to minimum IFR and route altitudes when necessary. You can't just descend below them freely. Making required IFR position reports if not in radar contact. Maintaining radio communications with ATC. Flying your cleared IFR route and adhering to any IFR clearance limits.
And who is responsible for seeing other traffic when you're VFR on top?
That's a key point. Because you are operating in VFR weather conditions, ATC is not providing separation from all other aircraft, particularly from uncontrolled VFR traffic that might be flying around. While ATC might provide traffic advisories if they see other targets, the ultimate responsibility for seeing and avoiding other aircraft rests with the pilot when operating VFR on top.
Does VFR on top mean you have to stay literally on top of clouds?
No, the handbook clarifies that. The term maintain VFR on top doesn't restrict you to operating only above a cloud layer. It simply permits operation above, below, between layers, or totally in the clear as long as you are maintaining VFR cloud clearance and visibility requirements. And maybe the most important thing to remember, accepting and operating VFR on top does not cancel your IFR flight plan. You are still an IFR flight in the ATC system.
Okay, that's VFR on top, IFR clearance, operating in VFR conditions, choosing VFR altitudes, still following many IFR rules, but responsible for see and avoid. Now, what about VFR over the top?
VFR over the top is completely different because it is purely a VFR operation. You are not on an IFR flight plan at all during this phase. It simply describes a scenario where a pilot flying under visual flight rules, VFR, climbs above an undercast cloud layer and continues their VFR flight legally on top of those clouds, maintaining all required VFR cloud clearance distances, like 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontally, while doing so.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you want to fly VFR between two airports. Both your departure and destination airports are reporting clear skies, VFR, but there's a solid layer of clouds in between along your route. You could potentially depart VFR, climb VFR while remaining clear of clouds until you get above that layer, fly VFR cruising over the top of the undercast, and then descend VFR, again remaining clear of clouds, into your destination airport. No IFR clearance is involved or required for any part of that flight segment conducted VFR over the top.
Got it. So VFR on top is an IFR procedure giving altitude flexibility in VFR conditions, while VFR over the top is simply flying standard VFR above a cloud layer. That distinction is much clearer now. Okay, to bring everything we've discussed, the planning, the procedures, the hazards, the clearances all together, let's walk through the detailed example IFR flight provided in the handbook. This is a Cessna 182 and 1230A flying from Birmingham, Alabama, BHM, to Gulfport, Mississippi, GPT.
Right. This example flight really serves as a great practical illustration, tying together many of the planning elements and operational procedures we've covered from the handbook. It kicks off, as all good IFR flights should, the evening before the flight with that crucial pre-flight planning phase.
Starting early.
Definitely, yeah. The pilot first checks the overall weather forecast, noting a low-pressure system predicted to bring moisture, low ceilings, and low visibility into the region, basically, setting the stage and expectation for needing to fly IFR. Then they begin gathering all the necessary documents and materials.
What's on that list?
They need their IFR on-road charts covering the route, area charts if applicable for departure or arrival, the relevant U.S. Terminal Procedures publications, TPPs, containing approach plates, SIDs, stars, and airport diagrams for BHM, GPT, and potential alternates. They need to ensure their GPS database is current if they plan to use GPS for IFR navigation. They need the Airport Facility Directory, AFD, for detailed airport info, their navigation log forms ready, and, of course, the Pilot's Operating Handbook or Airplane Flight Manual, PO8AFM, for their specific Cessna 182.
And they think about themselves, too.
Yes, critically. They consider their personal minimums reflecting on their recent IFR experience, their overall proficiency, their physical condition, am I well rested, fit to fly, and setting personal weather minimums that might be higher than the legal minimums based on their comfort level.
Smart. Then they dig into the documents.
Right. They review the AFD entries for both Birmingham, BHM, and Gulfport, GPT, to familiarize themselves with airport details, frequencies, services, and check for any published preferred IFR routes between the two cities. They study the potential instrument approach procedures they might expect at GBT, Look for any applicable departure procedures, DPs at BHM or standard terminal arrival routes, STARS at GPT, and review the en route charts, paying close attention to minimum en route altitudes, MEAs, and minimum obstruction clearance altitudes, MOCAs, along their proposed route.
So what route do they actually plan?
Based on that review, the example pilot selects the following route. Depart BHM via the Birmingham 3 departure procedure, which takes them initially towards the Brookwood VORTAC, OKW. From OKW, they plan to fly Airwave Victor 209 southbound to the Kewanee VORTAC, EWA. From EWA, they plan to proceed direct to the Mindo intersection and RNAV waypoint using their GPS, and then continue from Mindo towards Gulfport, likely expecting vectors for an approach from there.
And altitude.
They select an initial cruising altitude of 4,000 feet MSL. This altitude meets the regulatory requirements for direction of flight under IFR, odd thousands southbound below FL 180, and is suitable for the aircraft's performance and the MEAs along the early part of the route.
Okay, route and altitude picked. Then comes the formal weather briefing.
Correct. The example shows the pilot calling 1-800-WX-BRIEF to get an outlook briefing the night before. The briefer provides the forecast conditions, confirming that the weather is expected to be near, or possibly below, landing minimums at both BHM and GPT around their planned departure and arrival times. They also receive crucial NOTAMs, notices to airmen, for Gulfport during this call.
What were the NOTAMs?
The key ones mentioned were that the localizer component of the ILS system for runway 32 at Gulfport was out of service, and that runway 1836 was closed.
Wow, those are pretty significant pieces of information for planning an approach.
Absolutely. That localizer NOTAM immediately tells the pilot that the primary ILS approach might not be available, or will have higher minimums, reinforcing the need to plan for alternatives, like a GPS or a VOR approach. The runway closure also affects alternate planning and ground operations. This highlights exactly why checking NOTAMs thoroughly is so vital before every IFR flight.
Okay, so armed with the outlook and NOTAMs, they continue planning.
Yes, they use that information to start filling out their navigation log, calculating initial courses, distances, and estimated times. Then, the morning of the actual flight, they obtain a full standard weather briefing, likely online in this example. This provides the current conditions, METARs.
And what were the conditions?
The METARs confirm that conditions are indeed low IFR at both Birmingham and Gulfport, with visibility down to a quarter mile in fog at both locations, caused by that very small temperature dew point spread we discussed earlier. The terminal forecasts, TAs, predict gradual improvement later in the day, but still challenging conditions around their planned times. The area forecast gives the bigger picture along the route, mentioning widespread IFR and marginal VFR, MVFR, conditions associated with the low-pressure system, rain, and identifies potential hazards.
Any warnings like SIGMETs?
They check specifically for SIGNETs, for severe weather, and PIREPs, pilot reports. Initially, none are active directly affecting their route, but they do note an AirMet for IFR conditions, another for turbulence covering their route, and a third AirMet for potential icing conditions, but primarily located north of their intended track. Later, they see PIREPs confirming light icing did occur in the area mentioned by that AirMet.
And they double-check the NOTAMs again.
Yes, always a good practice. They reconfirm the Gulfport localizer outage and runway closure haven't changed. This detailed weather picture, combined with the NOTAMs, prompts them to select a suitable alternate airport.
Where do they choose for an alternate?
They select Pensacola, Florida, PNS, because both its current METAR and its TAF show significantly better weather conditions, marginal VFR, rather than low IFR, providing a safe backup if they can't land at Gulfport.
This whole planning stage really emphasizes cross-referencing multiple sources and building a complete picture before you even think about starting the engine?
It absolutely does. And this is also where those personal minimums come back into sharp focus. The pilot needs to honestly assess, are these challenging conditions, even if technically legal, within my personal comfort zone and proficiency level today? In the example, the pilot analyzes the latest conditions. While minimums are low, they note the forecast trend is for improvement, the reported icing is north of their route, and temperatures are predicted to rise. Based on this complete assessment, they make the go-no-go decision to proceed with the flight.
But with a plan B.
Definitely. They know they have Pensacola as a viable alternate, and they also understand they need to constantly reevaluate the weather in flight. They make mental notes to be vigilant about turning on pitot heat before entering clouds, and to be prepared to take immediate evasive action, perhaps returning to Birmingham or diverting to an intermediate airport if they do encounter unexpected icing.
Do they also calculate aircraft performance using the POAAFM?
Yes, that's a critical part of the planning documented in the example. They compute expected true airspeed, required power settings, and fuel burn for the planned altitude and route using the aircraft's performance charts. They perform a weight and balance calculation to ensure they're within limits. They determine expected takeoff and landing distances considering the reported conditions and runway lengths. They specifically note the crosswind component expected at Gulfport for runway 14, ensuring it's within their limits.
And fuel planning is key for IFR.
Absolutely. They calculate the estimated flight time and fuel required for the trip to Gulfport, plus the fuel needed to fly from Gulfport to their alternate Pensacola, plus the FAA required fuel reserve, typically 45 minutes at normal cruise power for IFR. They verify that their aircraft with full tanks can carry sufficient fuel for all of that. They also review various weather charts, like the surface analysis chart showing pressure systems, the weather depiction chart showing areas of IFR, VFR, radar summary chart showing precipitation, and satellite photos to get a broad visual overview and help with diversion planning if needed and out.
Okay, meticulous planning complete. They finally file the flight plan, presumably with all that route info, altitude, alternate, and estimated times. Now, arriving at the airport on the day of the flight, what happens next?
Right, the preparation continues right up to departure. First, a thorough pre-flight inspection of the aircraft itself. This isn't just a quick walk-around. For IFR, it includes carefully checking logbooks to verify required inspections, our current airworthiness directives, ADs, the annual inspection, altimeter and static system checks within 24 calendar months for IFR, transponder check, also 24 months, and the VOR operational check within the last 30 days.
Checking the paperwork.
Critical paperwork. During the physical walk-around, they pay special attention to IFR-specific items, ensuring the pitot tube and static ports are clear and unobstructed, checking antennas for security and condition, verifying the alternator belt tension, power of the avionics is crucial. They also perform that operational check of the pitot heat system we mentioned earlier, turning it on briefly on the ground to confirm it's heating up, but not leaving it on too long to avoid overheating. Inside, they organize the flight deck meticulously, charts accessible, checklists ready, pencil sharpened. They also enter the planned flight plan route into their IFR-certified GPS unit.
All set. Time to get the clearance and go.
Almost. First, they tune the ATIS, Automated Terminal Information Service broadcast for Birmingham, to get the very latest official weather, active runway, and any pertinent airport information. In the example, the ATIS information, let's say information kilo, confirms the weather hasn't changed significantly from their earlier briefing. Then, they contact clearance delivery.
What's the call?
Something like, Birmingham clearance delivery, Cessna 1230 Alpha, IFR to Gulfport Biloxi, with information kilo, ready to copy. Identifying who they are, where they're going IFR, that they have the current ATIS, and that they're ready to write down the clearance.
And they received that detailed clearance we heard an example of earlier. Does it match their filed plan?
Yeah, in this example, yes, it largely matches what they filed. Cessna 1230 Alpha is cleared to Gulfport Biloxi Airport via the Birmingham 3 departure, Brookwood transition, then Victor 209 Kiwani, then direct Mendo, Gulfport, climb and maintain 4000, departure frequency 123.8, SWAC 0321.
That's still a lot to absorb and read back accurately under pressure.
It is. They carefully read back the entire clearance verbatim to the controller to ensure there were no misunderstandings. Once confirmed, they review the specifics of the Birmingham 3 departure procedure again, noting the departure frequency given, 123.8, which matches the south sector frequency on the DP chart, and importantly, any initial altitude or heading restrictions in this case. The DP requires climbing straight ahead to 2,100 feet before making any turns after departing runway 24. They then tune their navigation radios, maybe setting OKW VOR, set the initial departure frequency in the standby comm, set the assigned squawk code 0321 in their transponder, and configure their GPS for the departure. Ready to taxi. Now they contact ground control. Birmingham ground, Cessna 1230 Alpha at General Aviation Parking, ready to taxi IFR Gulfport. They receive taxi instructions. Cessna 30 Alpha, taxi to runway 24 via taxiway mic. They acknowledge and begin taxiing using the airport diagram to navigate the taxiways and performing instrument checks along the way, like ensuring the attitude indicator is stable, heading indicator matches the compass, altimeter set correctly.
Holding short of the runway now.
Yes. At the hold short line for runway 24, they complete their before takeoff checklist, including the engine run-up. Once complete and everything looks good, they advise the tower they're ready for departure. Birmingham Tower, Cessna 1230 Alpha, ready for departure, runway 24, IFR.
And the takeoff clearance comes.
Yes, the tower issues the clearance. Cessna 30 Alpha, cleared for takeoff runway 24, caution wake turbulence, departing Boeing 737. They acknowledge, taxi into position on the runway, make a final note of the time off, quickly verify their sight instruments again, heading indicator aligned, airspeed alive, ensure the transponder is set to ALT mode, and confirm lights and pitot heater on. Then, they smoothly apply takeoff power. Because of the wake turbulence caution, the pilot in the example uses a technique to mitigate the risk, planning their rotation point to be before the point where the preceding heavy jet likely lifted off.
Smart. Okay. Airborne and climbing into the clouds. What's next?
They climb straight ahead, maintaining runway heading up to 2,100 feet NSL, as required by the Birmingham 3DP's climb restriction for runway 24. Once they pass 2,100 feet and any geographical restriction point mentioned on the DP, they can begin their turn towards the course specified by the DP, or vectors if assigned, and continue their climb towards their initial assigned altitude of 4,000 feet.
When do they talk to departure control?
As they climb through a certain altitude or reach a certain point specified by local procedures, the tower controller instructs them. Cessna 30 Alpha, contact departure. They acknowledge the frequency change, contact departure 30 Alpha, and immediately switch to the departure frequency they were given in their clearance, 123.8. Their initial call to departure is concise. Birmingham departure, Cessna 1230 Alpha, climbing through 2,700, heading 240, or whatever their current heading is.
And departure takes control. What do they say?
Departure control replies, verifies radar contact, and in this example, gives them their routing clearance off the DP. Cessna 30 Alpha, radar contact. Proceed direct to Brookwood VOR, resume navigation. Contact Atlanta Center now on frequency 134.05.
Okay, direct Brookwood, talk to Atlanta Center.
Right. They acknowledge the instruction, tune the Atlanta Center frequency 134.05, contact them, Atlanta Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha, level 4,000. Confirm their altitude, and use their GPS to navigate directly to the Brookwood Vortex, OKW, effectively leaving the DP routing behind as instructed. Atlanta Center might later issue further instructions or hand them off again. In the example, Atlanta Center eventually says, Cessna 1230 Alpha, contact Memphis Center, frequency 125.975.
More handoffs as they proceed along the route.
Very standard for IFR flights covering longer distances, crossing different ATC sector boundaries. They contact Memphis Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha, level 4,000. Memphis acknowledges them and might provide a local altimeter setting. In this case, Memphis also issues a traffic advisory. Cessna 30 Alpha, traffic at your 2 o'clock, 6 miles northbound, is a King Air climbing from 5,000 to 12,000.
And since they're likely still in the clouds at 4,000 feet.
Exactly. They can't see the traffic. So the pilot acknowledges the advisory and reports their inability to see the traffic because they are in IMC, Instrument Meteorological Conditions. Roger, Memphis, understand traffic. Cessna 30 Alpha is an IMC, negative contact. They continue monitoring their instruments and navigating along their cleared route, Victor 209 from Brookwood, then direct Mindo, using their navigation log to record the actual time they pass over each significant fix.
At some point during the en route phase, the pilot in the example decides they want an updated weather briefing. How do they manage that while talking to ATC?
Good point. They need to get ATC's permission to temporarily leave the frequency. Looking at their en route chart near the Kewanee EWA Vortex, they find the frequencies for the controlling flight service station, which is Greenwood FSS in this area. The chart shows they can listen to Greenwood radio on the EWA VOR frequency, 113.8 megahertz, and transmit to them on 122.1 megahertz. So they first ask Memphis Center. Memphis Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha request frequency change for flight service.
And ATC approves?
Typically, yes, unless there's an immediate control instruction pending. Memphis Center would likely respond, Cessna 30 Alpha, frequency change approved, report back on this frequency. The pilot then switches their comm radio to 122.1, calls Greenwood Radio. Greenwood Radio, Cessna 1230 Alpha, receiving Kewanee VOR, over, confirms two-way communication and requests an updated weather briefing for conditions currently along their route at their destination, Gulfport, and at their alternate in Pensacola.
What does the FSS briefer tell them in the example?
Greenwood provides the latest METARs. Gulfport is still reporting low conditions. 400 feet overcast ceiling, 3 miles visibility in light rain, along with current winds and altimeter setting. The weather along the remainder of their route is described as IFR in light rain, with ceilings generally 300 to 1,000 feet overcast and visibility 1 to 3 miles. Pensacola weather is confirmed as still better, 2,500 feet overcast, 6 miles visibility. They also quickly recheck the crucial NOTAMs for Gulfport, confirming the localizer issue and runway closure are still in effect.
And the pilot volunteers a PIREP back to FSS.
Yes, it's a great example of good airmanship. The pilot offers a pilot report. Greenwood, Cessna 30 Alpha, would like to offer a PIREP. They then provide the standard elements. Aircraft type ID, location, example 30 miles south of Kiwani, altitude 4,000 feet, flight conditions in IMC, smooth ride. Outside air temperature, +1 degree C, and confirming negative icing. FSS thanks them for the report, which helps other pilots and forecasters.
Then back to talking to Memphis Center.
Right. They switch their comm radio back to the Memphis Center frequency and report back on. Memphis Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha is back on your frequency. Memphis acknowledges them and shortly after issues the next handoff. Cessna 30 Alpha, contact Houston Center now, frequency 126.8. They acknowledge, switch frequencies, and make their initial call to Houston Center. Houston Center, Cessna 1230 Alpha, level 4000. Houston Center acknowledges and provides the current area altimeter setting.
Okay, they're getting closer to Gulfport now, under Houston Center's control. What happens as they approach the terminal area?
About 40 miles north of Gulfport, the pilot tunes the Gulfport 8S. That's an excellent catch, and it highlights a potential discrepancy or simplification in the handbook's example narrative. A localizer outage would normally preclude flying a standard ILS approach. Perhaps the NOTAM was for a different runway's localizer, or maybe the example intended to show the pilot resolving this conflict. However, the pilot in the example proceeds based on the definitive NOTAM information they received earlier.
So they plan for a different approach despite what ATIS says.
Exactly. It shows that pilots must sometimes synthesize conflicting information and rely on the most restrictive or safety-critical piece, which is often a NOTAM. Houston Center eventually issues the final handoff. Cessna 30 Alpha, contact Gulfport approach control on frequency 119.6. They acknowledge and contact Gulfport approach.
What's their call to approach?
Gulfport approach, Cessna 1230 Alpha, level 4,000 feet, with information Tango. Request the GPS runway 14 approach. Notice they specifically request the GPS approach, consistent with knowing the ILS localizer might be unreliable or out of service based on the NOTAM.
Smart. How does approach control respond?
Gulfport approach replies, Cessna 30 Alpha, Gulfport approach, descend and maintain 3,000 feet. They read back the instruction, descend and maintain 3,000, Cessna 30 Alpha, and begin their descent from 4,000 down to 3,000 feet.
Setting up for the GPS approach now.
Right. While descending, they configure their navigation equipment for the approach. Their IFR GPS automatically switches from en-route mode to terminal sensitivity as they get closer. They load and activate the GPS runway 14 approach procedure in their navigator. As a backup and for enhanced situational awareness, they also tune the Gulfport viewer TAC frequency, 109.0 MHz, into their number one VOR navigation radio and set the final approach course of 133 degrees on the Omni Bearing Selector, OBS. This gives them a cross-reference should the GPS have an issue.
Then they get the actual approach clearance.
Yes. Approach control provides the clearance. Cessna 30 Alpha, your position is 7 miles from Mindo intersection. Maintain 3,000 feet until Mindo. You are cleared for the GPS runway 14 approach. They read back the clearance carefully and now focus entirely on flying the aircraft precisely according to the procedure.
Following the vertical path now, too.
Yes. When they reach the Mindo waypoint, which serves as an initial approach fix on this procedure, they begin their descent from 3,000 feet down to 2,000 feet, as depicted on the approach chart altitude profile. At the next waypoint along the approach, Brawa, they make a turn to intercept the final approach course segment, heading 133 degrees inbound. Just before reaching the final approach waypoint, FIWP, named AVWAM on this approach, their GPS navigator automatically switches into approach mode, which makes the course deviation indicator, CDI, much more sensitive for the fine tracking required on final.
Getting very close now. Who do they talk to next?
As they approach the FIWP, Gulfport approach instructs them. Cessna 30 Alpha, contact Gulfport Tower now on frequency 123.7. They read back the frequency, 123.7 Cessna 30 Alpha, and switch their primary comm radio to the tower frequency. Their call to the tower is Gulfport Tower, Cessna 1230 Alpha, currently outside AVYM on the GPS runway 14 approach.
Does the tower give them updated weather? Seems conditions were pretty low.
Yes, the tower provides the latest conditions observed at the airport. Cessna 30 Alpha, Gulfport Tower, winds are 170 at 8 knots. The ceiling is now 600 feet overcast, and the visibility is currently 4 miles. So conditions have improved slightly from the early reports, now above typical approach minimums.
And the magic words? Landing clearance.
Finally, yes. Cessna 30 Alpha cleared to land runway 14. The pilot acknowledges, completes their final landing checklists, crosses the AVYUM waypoint, the AVBOP, and begins their final descent from the procedure altitude towards the runway.
When do they actually see the runway?
According to the example, as they descend through about 700 feet MSL, which is above the likely decision altitude for this GPS approach, they acquire visual contact with the airport runway environment. They report runway in sight, transition from instrument focus to visual cues for the landing, slow the aircraft down, and configure it fully for landing, flaps, etc., allowing a normal, stable descent to touchdown.
Safely on the ground, what happens immediately after landing?
As they touch down on runway 14 and begin to slow down, the tower provides taxi instructions. Cessna 30 Alpha, turn left next taxiway, that's Bravo, remain on this frequency for now. Actually, contact ground point 9er when clear. Corrected based on typical procedure.
Okay, contact ground when clear.
Right. They acknowledge, left on Bravo, contact ground point 9er, Cessna 30 Alpha, carefully taxi clear of the active runway onto taxiway Bravo, stop past the hold short line, and then contact ground control on 121.9 megahertz for taxi instructions to parking. They also complete their after-landing checklists. And importantly, because they landed at Gulfport, which has an operating control tower, their IFR flight plan is automatically canceled by ATC upon landing. No need for them to call and cancel.
Wow. That detailed walkthrough of the example flight really brings everything we've discussed from the handbook to life. You see the whole process unfold from the intense pre-flight planning and document review, through obtaining and flying complex clearances, navigating the ATC system with handoffs and frequency changes, getting weather updates, managing potential hazards like the NOTAM issue, selecting and flying a precise instrument approach, and finally getting safely onto the ground when the weather is far from ideal.
It really does illustrate just how structured, regulated, and procedure-driven the entire world of IFR flight has to be for safety and efficiency. We've essentially taken the core information from that section of the Instrument Flying Handbook and followed it step by step through a realistic scenario, highlighting the critical procedures, the communication requirements, and the pilot's decision-making responsibilities at each and every stage.
It's truly a fascinating look at that intricate dance, isn't it? Between the pilot, the complex systems within the aircraft, and the extensive air traffic control network, all working together to allow safe navigation through the skies even when you can't rely on looking out the window.
Yeah, it demands incredible precision, constant discipline, adherence to procedures, and ultimately a profound trust in both the established procedures and the ATC system itself.
Thinking about that deep reliance on instruments, procedures, and the unseen guidance from controllers when those primary visual cues are limited or gone, what single aspect of this whole complex IFR system do you personally find most remarkable or surprising when you step back and look at it?